Michael Wittmann is the most famous tank commander of the Third Reich.
He was the most decorated German tank ace of the war.
At Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, he spearheads the attack.
Whitman just accumulated kill after kill.
In Normandy, Wittmann single-handedly halts an Allied advance.
One German tank was able to knock out so many British tanks in a matter of a few minutes.
Wittmann's final battle turns him into a Nazi legend.
It was almost suicidal for the Germans to mount that attack.
Even though it's been 60 years after Whitman's death, his legacy, his mystique maintains today.
Le Cam German Military Cemetery, Normandy, France. 21,000 graves, a monument to the death of the German army in Normandy and to the downfall of Adolf Hitler's reviled Third Reich. And yet amongst the rows of unadorned gravestones, there is one man's grave that is always honored with fresh flowers. His name, Michael Wittmann. Wittmann is considered the greatest tank ace of all time.
He was the ace of aces. Many people say that he was a very quiet, likable man. He wasn't your typical Nazi.
Most tank commanders weren't personally decorated by Hitler, but most didn't quite stand out with the number of kills that Wittmann did. Whitman's mentality was aggressive, motivated, disciplined, kind of encapsulates the Panzer arm of World War II into a person.
Wittmann died here in the fields of Normandy. But his legend began in the fields of Bavaria. Born in 1914 on a farm south of Nuremberg, Wittmann was a country boy living the healthy outdoor life. At 19, Wittmann is drafted into the army for compulsory service, as all young men are in the Germany of Adolf Hitler. In 1937, after completing his service, Michael Wittmann, aged 23, eagerly volunteers for Hitler's personal bodyguard, the Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler.
It's an elite unit. They were in parades, they were very regimented. It would have been hand-picked personnel. They would have had certain height and physical fitness requirements, a certain look. He's not only a volunteer, but he's seemingly politically indoctrinated to want to be part of this unit.
I swear to thee, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, loyalty and bravery. I vow to thee obedience unto death.
Being the honor guard, I'm sure it was very appealing to somebody in their early 20s. With the black uniforms and the smart look and the whole elite quality about them.
Michael Wittmann embraces absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler and his policy of persecution of the Jews, and to his program of conquest and expansion of the Third Reich. But in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, triggering the Second World War. Now for Wittmann and his generation of young Nazis, the parades are over and the fighting begins. Because of his excellence as a driver, Wittmann is given command of a reconnaissance vehicle. By early summer 1941, the Nazis are the masters of Europe. But for Adolf Hitler, the real prize lies to the east, the Soviet Empire, vast spaces for the master race to conquer and colonize. June 22nd, 1941. Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Codename Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, led by 3,600 tanks, plunge into the Soviet Union. Against the Germans, the Soviets mobilize 2.9 million men and 20,000 tanks. Despite their superior numbers, the Soviets are quickly overwhelmed by the speed and skill of the German panzers. Michael Wittmann's reconnaissance unit races over the Soviet frontier with the Leibstandarte, part of the leading armored force.
Hitler's armored divisions were important in the fact that they were the ones that were spearheading the advances. The whole mentality of the tank force was always keep moving.
Wittmann and the Leibstandarte are now part of the notorious Waffen-SS.
The Waffen-SS had a few premier divisions, Leibstandarte being one of them, that maintained its elite status throughout the war.
As the panzers slash hundreds of kilometers through Russian defenses, millions of prisoners are taken.
The Waffen-SS does have a reputation for committing atrocities on the Eastern Front.
Over 3 million will be shot or starved to death. 3 weeks after the invasion, the Leibstandarte is closing in on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. At the forefront is Reconnaissance Sergeant Michael Wittmann. July 12, 1941. The panzers advance over hilly, wooded country. As they near the city of Zhytomyr, 200 kilometers southwest of Kiev, the Soviets counterattack. Dozens of Soviet T-34 tanks bear down on the Leibstandarte. The T-34 has been a shock for the Germans. Weighing 26 tons, the T-34 is heavily armored with sloping sides to deflect shells. Armed with a powerful 76.2 millimeter gun, it is better than anything the Germans can field. Wittmann is ordered to reconnoiter the enemy forces in a Sturmgeschütz 3 or Stug.
Wittmann drove his Sturmgeschütz to high ground to try to locate the Soviets. He spotted 2 groups of Soviet T-34 tanks, 6 coming from northeast and another 12 from the east. That meant 18 T-34s against Wittmann's single assault gun. It was no match. Wittmann had to act quickly to even the odds. He ordered his driver to take the Sturmgeschütz off the high ground.
Wittmann has been ordered not to engage the enemy tanks, as the heavier T-34s outgun his Sturmgeschütz 3.
Sturmgeschütz is designed initially to be infantry support. It's not designed to engage other tanks.
Built on the chassis of a Panzer III, the Stug is a turretless assault gun, which means the driver has to swing the whole vehicle around to aim its high-velocity 75 millimeter cannon.
The Sturmgeschütz has a movable cannon of 24 degrees only. You have to face the enemy straight forward, not from the side. If you see the enemy, you have to turn.
Despite being outnumbered and outmatched by the Russian tanks, Wittmann disobeys his orders and attacks the T-34s.
His personality that was mated to the Panzer credo of attack, that would have been the first thing he was looking for, was an opportunity to be preempted.
As the T-34 surged forward towards the crest of the hill, Wittmann's only hope was to set up an ambush. It was a direct hit. A second T-34 surged over the hill. It went up in flames. A third T-34 managed to get a shot at Wittmann's Sturmgeschütz.
The T-34s were not as accurate, we thought at least, than ours.
More Russian tanks poured forward. There were just too many. Wittmann headed for cover. He used the assault gun's low profile to hide it in a small wood.
I liked the Sturmgeschütz because of the low silhouette. And that gave me a feeling being safer.
But facing so many T-34s, there was nowhere for him to hide. Wittmann's driver swiveled the Stu to bring its gun to bear on the Russian.
Firing would have definitely been an issue because of the inability to track a target via a turret. You would have to maneuver the vehicle.
And again, his gunner scored a direct hit.
With the T-34. The only weak part is between the turret and the body, to get right into the crack.
Another T-34 tried to target the thin side armor on the Sturmgeschütz. Wittmann had to turn quickly and fire before the Russian got in a shot.
You hit the tracks if you can. When the tracks burst, of course, he just goes around in a circle.
With his fast maneuvering, Wittmann began to even the odds. Then, 3 more enemy tanks attacked. Wittmann opened fire. Only one of the Soviet tanks escaped.
6 of the formidable T-34s destroyed in just a few minutes. Wittmann and his crew stopped the Soviet armored attack. For his actions, Wittmann is awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. Impressed by his exploits, Wittmann's commanders send him back to Germany to train to become an officer of the SS. Wittmann's career is on the rise. Autumn 1942, Bad Tölz, Germany. Michael Wittmann begins his training in Heinrich Himmler's Waffen-SS school. Its aim is to form a new SS military elite, the future leaders of Hitler's Nazi empire. Wittmann graduates as an SS second lieutenant and is soon training on Germany's newest tank, the Tiger. Hitler's answer to the Soviet T-34, it is the most formidable tank in the world. At 100 millimeters, the Tiger's frontal armor is virtually impregnable. Its 88-millimeter gun can cut through a T-34 at over 2 kilometers.
Wir waren und Tigerleute, waren stolz, hatten das beste Gerät, was wir hatten. Und es war auch ein guter Panzer. Und wir waren zum ersten Mal den russischen Panzern haushoch überlegen.
In February 1943, Wittmann is called back to the Russian front as part of the Leibstandart's new Tiger Company. But by the summer, the tide of battle is turning against Germany. Soviet forces surge west, creating a huge bulge protruding into the German lines near the Russian city of Kursk. Desperate to regain the initiative, Adolf Hitler plans a counteroffensive, Operation Citadel. It will be a two-pronged attack from north and south to chop off the bulge, leaving 500,000 Soviet soldiers cut off and trapped. For the Citadel offensive, the Germans have amassed 780,000 men and 2,500 tanks. To meet the Germans, the Soviets field almost 2 million men and more than 5,000 tanks. The Leibstandarte will be at the front of the southern attack. With them at the spearhead will be Michael Wittmann, now commanding a platoon of 5 Tiger tanks. On the eve of battle, Wittmann's commander reads out Adolf Hitler's message to the crews.
Soldiers, today You set out on a great offensive, whose result can decisively affect the outcome of the war. My soldiers, now, finally, you have better tanks than the enemy. The German homeland looks to you with ardent confidence.
We just thought we were superior to the Russian tanks. At least we were brainwashed to believe that, which helps to make you feel superior, you know. You know what propaganda does.
July 5th, 1943. At dawn, the Tiger crews wait for their attack to begin.
The order came over the tank radios. Panzers, forward! As we advanced, we were met by a relentless storm of fire. The Russians had prepared line after line of defenses, with dug-in T-34s.
Because the T-34 was inferior to the Tiger I, it needed to compensate for its deficiencies. One of the ways was to have pre-dug positions for the vehicles. The incoming round would have to penetrate several feet of dirt to be able to actually get to the vehicle itself.
The Tiger's powerful 88mm gun is able to break through the Russian defenses. While the Russian shells bounce off the Tiger's armor.
Overcoming line after line of Russian defense, Wittmann and the Tigers pushed towards their objective. But the Russians continued to throw wave after wave of tanks at our advance. These were all fresh targets for Wittmann's gunner. Wittmann's tank kept moving, firing as it turned, smashing one T-34 after another.
Knocking out 8 tanks and 12 anti-tank guns, this first day of battle has been a success for Wittmann and his elite crew.
We call it zusammengespielt, played together, you know, so that one interacts with the other the right way. The loader, the gunner, the commander, the driver, the radio man. It's a tightly knit group.
July 12, 1943. The Germans set off to assault the final Soviet defense line before Kursk. Wittmann's commander is wounded, and Wittmann must take over command of the Leibstandart's Tiger Company, just as the Battle of Kursk is about to reach its climax. Unknown to the Germans, the Russians are preparing a desperate last-ditch counterattack.
The Germans were on the verge of breaking through into open country, and the Soviets were starting to panic. They were going to throw whatever they had available into the mix.
The Russians send 500 tanks west to attack the German right flank, but the Waffen-SS tanks turn east. These huge tank forces are about to collide near the little town of Prokhorovka. Second Lieutenant Wittmann and his crew are ordered to high ground.
In the distance, what seemed like a dust cloud was rising. Suddenly, hundreds of Soviet tanks appeared at the crest of a hill, headed straight towards Wittmann. We were in shock. The Soviets were not on the defensive, they were attacking.
Just 1,600 meters from Wittmann, more than 100 Soviet tanks are charging towards him, over the gently rolling land of the steppe.
We had a number of hills, but it was predominantly open terrain, so the Tiger tank could engage at long distance.
With a well-aimed shot, a Tiger can knock out a T-34 at a distance of 2 kilometers. But the Russian tanks have to get much closer before their guns can have any effect on the Tigers.
Wir kamen im Angriff, man muss sich das so vorstellen, Panzer an Panzer, die große Kette, und auf der anderen Seite kamen die T-34 an.
The T-34s raced towards us, trying to close the deadly gap. They came back into view, now only 800 meters away. The Tigers opened fire.
A lot of tanks in a relatively small area. Something of a shooting gallery from a Tiger I commander's perspective.
The T-34s were still not close enough to penetrate the armor of the Tigers, so they had to keep advancing, straight through our barrage. They got to 700 meters. Getting closer. And closer. The Tiger guns were belching fire, but there were too many. They couldn't all be stopped.
В это время немцы уже наступали, немецкие войска. Они были на ходу.
The Russians slam into the SS formation.
Они рассчитывали, что мы в контратакаде это будем, а тут хлестнули две массы.
At close range, the German tanks are vulnerable. Whitman's Tigers spring into action. Whitman's gunner fires on the move, again and again.
One of the reasons that Whitman was so successful as a Tiger commander was his ability to fire while moving with the vehicle. And that way they could acquire the target, but they'd get rounds on the target more quickly. Such a technique wasn't normal. In fact, German regulations stressed that the tanks should not fire when on the move. It's basically a waste of ammunition.
But Whitman and his crew have mastered the difficult technique, using it to their advantage.
From Whitman's perspective, Prokhorovka would have just been chaos. It would have had firing at close range.
Whitman's tank is hit twice, but keeps on fighting.
Gemetzelt auf beiden Seiten, Panzer auf Panzer.
The battle rages for hours. The Russians take appalling losses. But they succeed in slowing the German advance.
Бомбила наша авиация, бомбила немецкая. Я думал, что они, наверное, даже цели не искали. Бросали бомбы и все.
Kursk is considered one of the greatest tank battles in history because of the numbers of tanks and other armored vehicles involved in a relatively small area.
Our Tiger Company had a series of fine successes. Over the whole Citadel Kursk battle, we destroyed 151 enemy tanks.
Despite the success of the Tiger units, the ferocious Russian defenses has stopped Hitler's offensive. The Germans have lost the decisive tank battle on the Eastern Front. From now on, Michael Whitman will be fighting for his and for Nazi Germany's survival. In its third winter on the Eastern Front, the German army is in full retreat. The Russians have pushed them 500 kilometers from Kursk back into the Ukraine. Michael Whitman's Tiger unit is fighting a series of desperate rearguard actions.
Tiger units would have been sent from one sector of the front to the other to try and plug gaps that had been opened up by Soviet armored forces and attempted to blunt them so that way German forces can continue their retreat to the west.
The rapid Russian advance leaves the Soviet supply lines stretched dangerously thin, making supply convoys a vital necessity. December 6, 1943. Whitman and his unit, now designated the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, are poised to attack a Soviet supply convoy near the town of Brusilov. But between the convoy and the Tigers are batteries of Russian anti-tank guns. The Soviet's 76.2 millimeter divisional gun is a tank killer. It can smash through a Tiger's side armor at a distance of nearly 1,000 meters and wreck its tracks. To kill these anti-tank batteries, Whitman's tactic is to play a dangerous game, using himself and his tank as bait.
Whitman drove to high ground. He was tempting the Russian gunners to fire at him. They took the bait, but now the gunners had revealed their positions. Under heavy fire, Whitman quickly retreated. Then our Tigers raced at the anti-tank guns from their blind spots, charging straight at them before the Russians could turn the guns around.
Whitman's tactic has worked. The anti-tank batteries are now a smoking wreck. But his Tiger reveals just how dangerous Whitman's game can be.
We counted a total of 28 hits on the Tiger. Some of them were smaller, of course, but there were also some big enough to easily put one's fist into.
With the anti-tank batteries eliminated, Whitman races towards the supply road. He drives into cover to observe the road, and he spots a convoy. Though he's heavily outnumbered, Whitman decides to attack on his own.
Whitman would have been trying to make the best of a bad situation. He would have been increasingly reckless due to necessity in engaging enemy targets.
Like a wolf attacking its prey, he quickly knocks out the lead tank and the rear tank, leaving the convoy trapped on the road at his mercy.
Whitman blasted the enemy with furious barrages of gunfire. He placed his fiery mark on the road, smashing long lines of Soviet vehicles into junk. This caused mass confusion amongst the Soviets.
Whitman's daring lone wolf attack has worked brilliantly. The Russian convoy has been destroyed. Over the next few weeks, he goes on a rampage, knocking out 61 enemy tanks. His total kills soon reach 117. He paints the number of kills on his tank barrel. On January 16, 1944, Whitman is awarded the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's second highest military honor. Then, just a few weeks later, his Knight's Cross is upgraded with oak leaves, and he is promoted to first lieutenant. On February 2, 1944, Whitman is called to the Führer's Eastern Front headquarters to receive his new commendation from Adolf Hitler himself.
I think one of the reasons that Whitman was decorated to the degree that he was that he was part of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler division. And that's Hitler's name in the unit.
Whitman is now ordered back to Germany, where his exploits have already made him famous. But the country he finds upon his return is in ruins, a result of Allied bombing.
The sight of such senseless destruction of our cities is enough to make one's heart bleed. The Anglo-Americans have taught us to hate. They will see this hate transformed into energy. We desire one thing: to get them in front of our guns. we have only one watchword, and that is revenge.
The war effort was definitely going against Germany, and they were looking for ways to keep up the public morale. He visited the Henschel factory where the Tiger One was made and made a speech to the workers there. I think Whitman was used as propaganda for the Nazi Party, but I don't think it was totally unwilling on his part. I think it was just another way of contributing to the war effort. The Reich made him a celebrity intentionally.
During his triumphal tour of Germany, Whitman marries 19-year-old Hildegard Burmester. The couple is offered a special wedding gift, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
Hitler went to Whitman's wedding. A tank ace in Germany was so important.
Before he can arrange a honeymoon for his young bride, Whitman receives a new posting. So his wife accompanies him with his Tiger Battalion to the Chateau Elbeuf in Normandy, France. Michael Whitman will soon have his chance at revenge on Germany's enemies. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces land in Normandy. Hitler orders his panzer forces to drive the Allies back into the sea. For Michael Whitman and his Tigers, the Allied beachhead is over 200 kilometers away.
Whitman started off on June 6 with 45 Tiger tanks, which is a full complement for that 101st Heavy SS Tank Battalion.
But it takes Whitman 5 harrowing days to get his second company to the Normandy battlefield, under unrelenting attacks by Allied fighter bombers that decimate his forces.
And a week later, it was down to about 6 vehicles that were serviceable.
Whitman and the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion are positioned on the left and most crucial sector of the front, facing the British and the Canadians.
The Germans would have concentrated their armored units around the British and Canadian sector, because if that sector had fallen, that would have been the shortest route to Germany. So they had to hold that with their stronger units.
The Allies are preparing the break out of the beachhead. Their plan is to send the British 7th Armored Division towards the key city of Caen, through the town of Villers-Bocage. June 13th, 1944. Sheltering from Allied bombers, Whitman positions his surviving Tigers under the cover of trees, near Villers-Bocage.
The British 22nd Armored Brigade was moving through the town.
The column of British tanks is just 200 meters from Whitman's position. The British do not know Whitman is there, but they are about to find out.
Then a man came into the command post and said, "Obersturmführer, tanks are driving past. I don't think they're German." I had no idea that the enemy might suddenly appear.
Whitman saw that there was an opportunity and that the British armored vehicles were in a nice, neat line approaching his position.
I went outside and saw English and American tanks rolling past, about 150 to 200 meters distance. Never had I been so impressed by the strength of the enemy as I was by those tanks rolling by.
Whitman is facing 138 tanks and armored vehicles, while he has only 6 tanks.
The decision to attack was a very difficult one. But I knew it absolutely had to be, and I decided to strike out at the enemy.
Whitman's split-second decision will become legendary.
I had no time to assemble my company. I set off with 1 tank. I drove up to the column, surprised the English as much as they had surprised me. I first knocked out 2 tanks from the right of the column, then 1 from the left.
With them being in such close proximity to each other, there was no room to maneuver.
I then turned about to the left and attacked the armored troop carriers in the middle of the armored regiment. They never left the road. They were so surprised that they took to flight, but not with their vehicles. Instead, they jumped out, and I shot up the battalion's vehicles as I drove by. I drove towards the rear of the column on the same road, knocking out every tank that came toward me. The enemy was thrown into total confusion. I was able to take out tanks as well as armored troop carriers. Then I drove straight into the town of Villers-Bocage.
The town has already been occupied by British armor. Whitman continues his single-handed attack, claiming a total of 21 Allied tanks destroyed.
I got to approximately the center of town, where I was hit by an anti-tank gun. My tank was disabled. I fired at and destroyed everything around me that I could reach. I then abandoned the tank.
Whitman's deadly rampage has lasted barely 15 minutes, but he has devastated an entire enemy regiment.
By single-handedly knocking out the British column, it kept the Allies from taking the area around Caen for 2 months, and it added to the mystique of Whitman's abilities as a panzer commander.
German newsreels make the most of the Allied setback at Villers-Bocage.
In den engen Straßen wurde eine stärkere amerikanische Panzereinheit gestellt und zusammengeschossen.
Whitman is the most famous tank officer in the German army.
Rund 1000
But the following day, the stress of battle shows on his face. Whitman is celebrated for his astounding feat by 1st SS Panzer Corps Commander Sepp Dietrich, who recommends him for yet another commendation. In July, Whitman is once again personally decorated by Hitler, this time adding 2 swords to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves.
Whitman was the most decorated tank commander, not only for his experience on the battlefield, but I would think also for the propaganda value that could be showcased through him.
And so Michael Whitman reaches the height of his fame in Normandy. And it is in Normandy that his fate and his myth will be sealed. August 8th, 1944, 2 months after Villers-Bocage. Michael Whitman is now a captain and acting commander of his battalion. Yet as Whitman's career soars, Hitler's army in Normandy is headed towards destruction. Now the Allies launch a decisive punch, codenamed Operation Totalize. British and Canadian armor storms along the Caen-Falaise Road, smashing 14 kilometers through the German lines towards the village of Sinto. As 300 Allied tanks bear down on Sinto, the 12th SS Panzer Division is ordered to bar their advance. With the remnants of the heavily outnumbered division is Captain Michael Whitman, with a small group of Tiger tanks. The division's leader, Colonel Kurt Mayer, now orders an immediate counterattack.
Whitman's Tigers were standing ready behind a hedge east of Sinto. We had to risk the attack in order to win time.
It was almost suicidal for the Germans to mount that attack but this was their system. If they were hit, they would hit back immediately.
Whitman is in reserve, but he insists on leading the attack.
Michael said to me, I must be in the attack myself, for the other officers can barely cope.
Kurt Mayer knows the situation is hopeless.
I shook Michael Whitman's hand. Michael laughed his youthful laugh and climbed into his Tiger.
And so Michael Whitman sets off on the attack. Just 8 German tanks advancing against 300 Allied tanks.
I don't think Whitman is exactly a fatalist. I don't think that he just figured that he was going to die, maybe this was the best place to do it. Whitman and probably his crew didn't think so much about their own personal safety as the overall war effort.
What Whitman doesn't know is there is a hidden danger waiting for him on either side of the Caen-Falaise road. British tanks of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry are lying in wait in the woods to his right. Canadian tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers are hidden behind a wall to his left.
We drove off. Michael right of the road and I left of the road. Approximately 800 meters to Michael's right, there was a small wood, which looked suspicious.
British tanks hidden in the woods observe Whitman.
There were certainly four Tigers, which came down on what would have been our side of the main road. The Canadians of the Sherbrooks were, as far as I can see, actually much nearer, but they were on the other side of the main road.
The Canadian tanks are hidden from Whitman's view behind a long chateau wall.
We sneaked up right beside a brick wall and got in reasonable cover. Just hit the wall just enough that you could get your gun, that you could move it sufficiently. I could see on the right the first German tanks came out from Syntho. Right away, I can remember the wireless net becoming active. I can see them, I can see them.
I saw these Tigers come in, across in front of us, about 1,200 yards away. My tank commander, he said, well, wait till they get to about 800 yards.
We drove about 1 to 1.5 kilometers.
I was now starting to get a bit itchy.
The Allies not only have the element of surprise, they have a new tank, the Sherman Firefly. The Firefly, upgunned with a powerful 17-pounder cannon, is able to penetrate 130 millimeters of steel. Enough for even the thickest armor on a Tiger.
For the first time, we realized that we now had a tank which was equal to the Tiger.
Whitman's Tigers are now in the kill zone.
With my eyes, I could see the tank closest to the road, about 200 yards, I guess.
The tank commander said, advance driver, and we pull out of cover. As we pull out of cover, he says, target the rear Tiger. I fired.
We began taking heavy fire, and then I received a radio message from Michael.
Achtung! Achtung! Von rechts!
I'd look round at the second tank. I fired one shot at the second tank. The loader reloads. Again, fired when ready.
3 of the 4 Tigers are now knocked out. Whitman's tank moves on alone. From close range, the Canadians now open fire at Whitman's tank.
One that he was in, I think, went by me. Other people from my squadron were firing at it now.
Whitman's Tiger is hit.
When I got to within 300 meters of Michael's Tiger, flames suddenly shot from the tank.
I can remember a tremendous explosion and seeing the turret hit the ground.
August 8th, 1944. Michael Whitman has fought his final battle.
Whether his last thoughts as he went down the road were simply, Valhalla, here I come, a sort of a death wish. He must have known there was no way they were going to win.
August 25th, just days after Whitman's death, the German army in Normandy is defeated. Many of Hitler's soldiers remain in Normandy, buried in Lacan German military cemetery. Somber gravestones recall the unheralded end of the Nazi Empire. Yet Michael Whitman is still celebrated.
I think there's a myth to Michael Whitman's combat experiences. People look at him as, yes, being a Nazi, but it's not the reason that they admire his abilities in combat. I think if you're on the receiving end of that, you're going to have a different perspective.
He accepted the doctrines of Hitler enough to get in his tank and invade other people's countries, country after country, to kill men, women, and children. He might have been a hero to the Germans, but not to me.
Even though it's been 60 years after Whitman's death, his legacy, his mystique, maintains to today.
I swear to thee, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, obedience unto death.
February 26, 1945. Canadian tanks attacked Germany's last line of defense west of the Rhine River.
This was one of the heaviest battles on the Western Front during the Second World War.
The Germans are outnumbered and desperate, determined to defend the fatherland at any cost.
I'd rather take a few more enemies with me to the grave. That's what they were saying.
They lure the Canadians into a trap, and the armored advance turns into a fight for survival.
Every move that you make, they can see it, and it was just like shooting fish in a rainbow.
At stake is nothing less than the fate of Germany, as these two forces fight for control of a patch of farmland, simply known as the Hochwald Gap.
All you knew is that you had to kill them.
The Rhineland, fertile farm country in western Germany. Today it's peaceful and serene. But in the winter of 1945, it's the scene of one of the most ferocious and costly battles of the Second World War. February 1945, the Second World War in Europe enters its final months. Allied armor rolls into the German Rhineland, and leading the attack is the 1st Canadian Army. Their objective, the Rhine River, and on the other side, central Germany. The Canadian mission is to hook up with British forces and push east, capturing bridges across the Rhine at the German town of Xanten. They've amassed a major strike force. 90,000 troops, 1,300 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 tanks. Their armored workhorse is the Sherman 5 tank. This 32-ton version of the Sherman has a short-barreled 75-millimeter gun and only 51 millimeters of frontal armor. That means less firepower and protection, but more maneuverability. And the Allies are able to produce thousands of them.
Well, the Sherman was a great little tank, and we had far more of them than the opposition had.
There was lots of them. That was one good thing. And the other thing was they were pretty rugged. They didn't require much maintenance. They were tough.
The Sherman had a short-barreled gun, so they could only damage us at a very close range.
Der Sherman
The Sherman wasn't as good as our Panther.
unterlegen.
He had a long cannon. They couldn't compare to the Panther.
The Panther is armed with a high-velocity 75-millimeter gun and is protected by 80 millimeters of sloping frontal armor. And with a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour, the Panther is one of the best designed tanks of World War II. But in the winter of 1945, it's numbers that count, and the Germans are at a disadvantage.
The Allies had so much more equipment, so much better supply for gas, food, and ammunition. We couldn't compete with that, and by 1945, we barely had any tanks left.
Kaum noch Panzer.
To defend the Rhineland, all the Germans are able to field are a handful of Panthers, almost a dozen of the heavier Tigers, and less than 100 anti-tank guns. It's an enormous disparity in men and firepower. But the Germans have another weapon. Sheer determination to stop the invasion of their homeland.
The day British and Canadian crossed the border to Germany, the Germans were defending their own country. Each of these soldiers thought not that he was fighting for Hitler or he was fighting for Hitler's regime, but he was fighting for his country, for his people at home.
It's called the fatherland, you know, in their terminology. So you're going to fight a hell of a lot harder than you would under normal circumstances. I was really amazed at the tenacity of them. It was just terrible, the resistance that they were putting up. You knew that they were going to be killed. They knew they were going to be killed. And they fought on anyway.
For many of our men, their homes had been destroyed.
Durch die Bombardierungen. Und die haben gesagt,
And they told themselves, what am I supposed to do at home? I'd rather take a few more enemies with me to the grave. That's what they were saying.
The Allied soldiers had to fight around every farm they saw, every little forest they saw, every little village they saw. They had to fight.
German resistance is ferocious, and as the battle enters its second bloody week, the assault bogs down. In 18 days of fighting, the Allies lose over 8,000 men and hundreds of tanks, while advancing only 25 kilometers. Allied command sends in Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, commander of the 2nd Canadian Corps, to get things moving. He implements Operation Blockbuster, a bold plan for tanks and infantry to attack quickly and at night, seizing the high ground between the villages of Kalkar and Udom. This will clear the way for his main force to cross a valley and overwhelm German defenders dug in along the Hochwald Ridge, their last line of defense before the Rhine River.
The Germans knew the terrain because it's their terrain. Yeah? And so it wasn't so important that they only had 10% of the army of the Allied. It is very easy to hide soldiers in these forests. It's very easy to hold up every soldier who's coming, every tank who's coming. And this made it very difficult to take this ridge and the Unbound.
But this is just the beginning of the Allies' problems. They also have to deal with the weather, and spring has come early to the Rhineland.
Because of the melting ice, 3 of the rivers were carrying so much water. We also destroyed the dams. And there were 2 other rivers that were carrying so much water, there was no way for them to get through. And there was also a lot of mud.
It flowed over all the roads, all the fences, and your maps became useless because all you could see was endless mud.
To the left and right of the roads, the ground had turned to swamp, so they had to stay on the roads. They couldn't use the fields. And there, they were easy targets for us.
In the early morning of February 26th, Canadian infantry, supported by nearly 80 tanks of the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, launched Phase 1 of Operation Blockbuster. Their mission is to take and hold the German-occupied Kalkar Ridge, clearing the way for the main attack against the Hochwald on the other side of the valley. It begins with an artillery barrage by 700 Allied guns.
All those guns broke loose, just tremendous fire. The sound of the gunfire and the tremendous volume of it as we were advancing, our own gunfire, it was a sound that was so great, you could feel it on your body. This constant roar, even inside of the tank, you could feel the guns. They make a little more noise when you're in front of them than they do when you're behind them. It was raining very steadily. The ground was just terrible, absolutely terrible. We pressed into the minefields, and the first 3 tanks hit mines. The teller mine would blow your track off, and it would buckle the floor under the driver. And that basically disabled the tank. We reported that we'd hit the minefield, and the 2 IC came on the air and said, "Press on." And they called Butler and said, "How the hell do you press on when you're in a minefield?" And this is in the dark. You really don't know what the hell you're doing. And we found sort of a little track or trail. And we turned right and went through the minefield basically on a country lane. So the Germans hadn't minded. The loader operator's job really is, like if they're not firing immediately, is to pivot your periscope. And as we progressed, I could see 2 German tanks off as they passed a burning barn. And I yelled into the mic, "German tanks."
They're Panthers, and they're easily able to outgun Hale's short-barreled Sherman.
You knew you couldn't do anything about it, particularly at a distance.
But the Canadians have some additional firepower. Each troop of 4 tanks includes at least 1 Sherman Firefly, armed with a long-barrel, high-velocity cannon. It's a tank buster, the so-called 17-pounder, able to penetrate 130 millimeters of armor at ranges of almost 1,000 meters.
But the long-barreled 17, you let him go in. You're not going to bother using a 75 against the front view of a German Panther.
first shot from the 17-pounder hits a barn. And the Panthers retreat in the smoke and confusion.
Typical German tactics. You have the tanks in front maybe, and as soon as the attack comes in, they fire and fire, and then they back away and draw you under their anti-tank guns.
Despite the danger, Hale and his squadron push on to the ridge.
We got to the top of the Kalkar Ridge itself, and then all of a sudden, wham, it was daylight.
John Hale and fellow tankers of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers head into the killing zone. If the Canadians fail to take Kalkar Ridge, Operation Blockbuster and the Allies' big push to the Rhine will be over before it really begins. February 26, 1945. Operation Blockbuster is underway. And the fighting is furious from the very first shots. Lieutenant General Guy Simmons sends scores of Sherman tanks into the thick of it. Their mission is to take and hold the heavily defended Kalkar Ridge, clearing the way for the main attack aimed at driving the Germans back across the Rhine River. But even though they're outnumbered, the Germans stubbornly stand their ground.
We got to the top of the ridge, and then all of a sudden, wham, it was daylight, and the Germans were shooting. They were being fired on from our left flank and in front. And I can remember particularly this barn on our left flank. And the doors were coming open. And we were yelling at the gunner, the doors are opening.
What Hale has spotted is the infamous 88, Germany's most powerful anti-tank weapon. The 88s fire armor-piercing shells, able to penetrate almost 100 millimeters of steel at distances up to 1,500 meters, and the Canadians are well within range.
I don't know about you or anyone else who's ever looked down the barrel of an 88. When it fires, you can actually see it coming at you. It's like a rolling ball, like a fist coming. You can see the sparks coming off of it. It passed over our tank and cut off the aerial within a foot of the tank behind us. Then we instantly fired just as soon as he had fired at us. Looking behind us, the Grenadier Guard tank that was liaison, his tank got hit. There's an immediate fusion of the metal into a cherry red glow where it's hit with a black hole in the middle of it. And the crew commander was coming out the hatch, and the ammunition exploded, and he just sort of threw up his arms and then collapsed down into the turret. There were still 6 of us left on the top, and we were all firing forward and to the left flank. And the Germans started cutting down the farmhouse structure. They were ripping it down, and we were using it for cover. We were pulling out and shooting and so on. We couldn't withstand the amount of fire that was coming at us. We were going to all get knocked out. The infantry had dug in and could defend their position. So we fired a smoke shell for 5 of the other tanks. One at a time, they pulled off the ridge as we blanked the left flank. By that time, the buildings were nearly gone and just burning rubble, and we decided to pull out. And the tank, in the heavy mud, we put it in first gear and pulled ahead, but it sort of snuffled under and stopped. And a German shell fired right across in front of us. then we started moving forward again, and then finally there was another shot came at us. And Butler was in the turret, and he was standing there, and he just sort of fell on the floor on his ass, and he said, "Oh!" And it had a strange sound to it, you know, sort of, it didn't have the crack, it had a whir. And I said, "What happened to that?" He said, "You wouldn't believe it, but that was coming for us, and it hit a hydro pole." We started out with a squadron, and 19 tanks and 1 liaison tank, and we wound up with 6. And that's my first introduction to the Rhineland battle.
More tanks join the attack, and the battle goes on into the next day. Finally, the outnumbered and outgunned Germans are forced to fall back, and the Canadians take Calcar Ridge. With Calcar Ridge secure, armor from the South Alberta Regiment moves forward for the main attack against the next ridge. It lies across a muddy valley and will give this battle its name, Hochwald. General Simmons' plan is for infantry supported by the tanks of A Squadron to advance towards the village of Udom and seize the rail embankment, while B Squadron attacks across the valley into a long gap flanked on either side by thick woods. The aim is to force the Germans back to the village of Xanten on the Rhine River. It's a bold plan, and it's off to a bad start.
When the time came, we moved out. I can still remember driving along, or slithering along, it's more like it. It took hours to go a mile. It was just unbelievable and very frustrating.
They were up to the sponson in mud. And so there we were, supposed to start at 11:30 at night, and we didn't get there till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning because of getting stuck, running out of gas, so on. It was almost daylight by the time they got it started, and you're going into the worst possible situation. You try not to have armor go through draws or files, and here is a wood on both sides, loaded with firepower. And we're leading into this absolute killing zone. To go into that gap the way we did, and it was just like shooting fish in a rain barrel.
The Canadian tanks were plowing through deep mud. We laid our gun on the leading tank, and by the time we were ready to fire, it had already been hit. And we swung our gun to another, but that too stopped. The third tank at which we aimed fired first. And the shell burst only yards in front of us. Quickly, we realigned our gun. The tank seemed to falter, and we fired.
We were just moving towards the position, and the incoming fire was such that you just could not exist there. To see these soldiers still trying to go forward and being hit is soul destroying.
While B Squadron takes a beating at the Hochwald Gap, A Squadron advances towards the rail embankment running through the village of Udom. It's the only piece of high ground in a sea of mud.
It was what they called a right hook to go around Udom and try and establish a front by the railway crossing. Supposedly the town looked pretty vacant, but all the time you don't take that for granted. Anything that moved, we were shooting it up. terrain was terrible. It was a real effort to get to our objective. Then on top of it, we had the traps. If you fell into one of those, you were finished right there. And here we were coming out onto a dike area, and unknown to us, on either side of the dike were big, deep ditches. The way those tank ditches were designed, as you were coming around, you'd eventually lock on to one of those roads. That was a little piece of high ground from the mud, and so we probably chose to take that. And then when you get on it, then of course you can't get off it. And we just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column. And they were just waiting for us. You know, we were sitting ducks.
The countryside near the German town of Udum shows little sign today of the ferocious battle that took place here. But during the final months of the Second World War, this quiet place was a battlefield. February 27th, 1945. Canadian Sherman tanks, avoiding minefields and mud, advance along a narrow dike, attempting to secure the railway embankment running through the town of Udum.
We just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column, is to have your tanks one behind the other. The Germans had placed a lot of Tigers embedded down in the ground area, and anti-tank guns, and they were just waiting for us. Eddie, he was at the front, saw the Tiger, and I guess he knew that the Tiger was drawing a bead on him. Eddie loaded up an AP, and he shot that out. According to him, he says the shell just bounced right off its hide. And so he knew that he had to go to stage 2, which was get that opening.
The German Tiger is a 57-ton monster. It's built like a battleship, protected in places by more than 100 millimeters of steel plate. The Tiger seems indestructible, but it has a weak point. A narrow gap in its armor where the turret meets the hull. A shell strike there can put it out of action.
He did. He managed to jam the Tiger.
But it does no good. The Canadians are caught in a trap. The Germans have prepared a perfect ambush.
And it was just very fast. They just took out the front tank, they took out the back tank, they just took every other tank out. We were hit in the soft spot, like in the back. It was very abrupt, deafening, instant. Right off the bat, then you jump into action. You got to get out. You know that baby is burning. She's growing up. We were fortunate, managed to get out. Corporal McGivern looked and he saw the old girl was burning up pretty bad at the back end, so he says, we got to get out of here. And he looked over and he says, there's a farmhouse. He says, it's a short distance away. He says, we'll make a run for it.
They reach the farmhouse only to be captured. Trooper Gardner and his tank crew spend the final months of the war in a prison camp. They're the lucky ones. In the first 2 days of battle, hundreds of Canadian soldiers die, and hundreds more are wounded. Grim proof of the fierce defense put up by the Germans.
When you were there at the time, you didn't understand why they were fighting so hard. You didn't know why they were fighting. You didn't have time to understand what they were doing. All you knew is that they were fighting, and they weren't surrendering.
Each of these soldiers believed that each day they could hold their position, would help their country, because it was so close to the industrial center of the German Reich. Most of the war industry was there.
Die Armee hat gekämpft,
The army was fighting to prevent any enemy from entering the fatherland. That's why we were fighting so hard.
Haben sie sehr stark gekämpft.
On the morning of February 28th, the Germans strike back at the Canadians' most vulnerable point, the Hochwald Gap. The Canadian tanks and infantry push into the gap and take ground near the western end. An advance force of Shermans moves forward to the midpoint in the gap. And the Germans pounce with Panther and Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns. Gunner David Marshall witnesses the attack.
Over the rise in front of us came the snout of 2 tanks, a Tiger and a Panther, heading our way. When our gunners had them in our sights, and before the German tanks could level out to bring their 88s down on us, our tanks opened fire, with all guns blazing. We stopped the attack, destroying the Panther and forcing the Tiger to retreat.
The Germans strike again and again, and the Canadians struggle to hold their ground. But just when their situation seems desperate, help comes roaring in from the skies.
The weather started to get better, and the fighter bombers came firing rockets. The typhoons were dangerous for us.
The typhoons would range in above you, behind you somewhere, with 20mm cannons. When they're converging on the target, then he lets go his rockets. And it's just a hell of a noise, and all you see is pieces. You'll break a Tiger or a Panther, break them in pieces. So they're very helpful.
The Typhoons, or Tiffies as the tankers call them, stop the German advance with their rockets. But in battlefield chaos, anything can happen, as Canadian tanker Bill Luton recalls.
The sound was heard overhead unlike anything I ever experienced in battle. Something like the noise of a high-speed train passing through a tunnel. I paused in wonderment, and then heard an explosion. I looked up to see the Tiffy flaring away.
Luton and his crew are under attack by the deadliest tank killer on the battlefield. One of their own Typhoon fighter bombers. The Battle of the Hochwald Gap enters its 3rd bloody day, and it's a standoff. The Germans won't back down, even though they're outnumbered and under attack by Allied warplanes. Rockets from Typhoon fighter bombers shred the Germans' dwindling supply of tanks.
They were dangerous, these Typhoons, attacking every tank.
The Typhoons swarm the Hochwald Gap, and in the chaos, one of them targets a Canadian tank.
A sound was heard overhead unlike anything I ever experienced in battle. I paused in wonderment, and then heard an explosion.
There's nothing Bill Luton and his tank crew can do but release canisters of yellow smoke to identify themselves as friendly.
Smoke blossomed gloriously on both sides of the tank, and just in time. But no, he kept coming, and dove directly at us. I saw a great puff of smoke and instinctively ducked inside. A futile gesture against a rocket. Again came the sound of the express train in a tunnel, and again the explosion. We were still alive to hear it, but Tiffy had missed again.
The Typhoons attack all morning, blunting the German attack. At noon, Canadian tanks push forward in another attempt to clear the Hochwald Gap. But again, they are stopped by German tanks and artillery. That night, tanks from the Canadian Grenadier Guards try again. But the Germans have perfect aiming points on either side of the gap. Tracer rounds light up the sky, and the Guards are caught in a crossfire. By the time it's over, they have gained no ground and lost 10 tanks.
We had the numbers of troops, weapons, and so on our side. But a very well ensconced enemy on the approaches can make you pay dearly, no matter if you have the odds.
Dawn, March 1st. The battle enters its 4th day, and the Canadians are still only halfway through the Hochwald Gap. German tanks and anti-tank guns in the woods on either side of the gap will have to be taken out one by one. That means attacking with tanks through the trees.
Fighting through two forests is an absurdity, just an absolute absurdity. You should never do it. The biggest problem was the Panzerfaust, was the one-shot rockets that they had.
Panzerfaust means tank fist. It's small, highly portable, and lethal. It fires a 140mm shaped charge at ranges of up to 60 meters and can penetrate 200mm of armor, tearing a hole through the tank and unleashing a devastating explosion inside.
He could hide in the wood. All he needed was an opening. He's got a big target, and once he hits that tank, there's a chance he sets off the ammunition in it, or starts the tank on fire, or he has wounded at least one or a couple of the crew.
They'll knock out a tank just like that. Bingo. I don't think tanks are that useful, but that's what you had. We were going through with the Fusiliers Montreal into the forest in daytime. And 4 tanks were in line ahead, which is not very effective, instead of being spread out. The major of the Fusiliers Montreal wanted us to use HE against this group of Germans in a clearing that was in front of us, which was our objective.
The Sherman 5 carries 2 main types of ordnance: armor-piercing shells for use against tanks, and HE, or high-explosive rounds for softer targets.
You'd have to be careful and use the shock action more than the weapon. The ground shakes like an earthquake. But the Germans were protected. If you brought fire on them, they had overhead cover. And as soon as the shelling stopped, they're back into position, throw the sticks and what have you out of the way, and they're ready for business.
The field artillery observation officer, he called in a crumpet 25-pounders. And all of a sudden, they came in and they landed on that clearing. Just the most magnificent shooting, and they just plastered about 10 or 15 rounds right in front of us.
The heavy artillery clears the Germans, and the battle continues for the next 36 hours, with tanks and artillery making small gains against fierce German resistance. Then, on the morning of March 4th, the battlefield is silent. During the night, the Germans have fallen back, leaving the Hochwald Gap for the Canadians. The Shermans advance, and their objective, the village of Xanten on the Rhine River, comes into view. This is where the Germans will make their last stand. For the exhausted and battered Canadians, the fighting is far from over. The Hochwald Gap, a remote patch of farmland in western Germany. In February 1945, this was the scene of one of Canada's most brutal and costly battles of the Second World War. After 5 days of fighting, the battle comes to a swift and surprising end. German forces retreat in the night, leaving the gap and the woods on either side to the Canadians.
This is an art that the Germans have, and we should really basically learn by it, because they have a habit of putting on a tremendous show so that the last thing you can think of is their withdrawing. But that's what they do, but they leave people in position who then are very aggressive with their weapons.
And they left 2 tanks, 2 Panthers. One was giving the other covering fire. One would sit there and poke at anybody who showed up on the top of the hill. The other guy had turned around and going like hell the other way. My buddy Ed was there, and Ed looked at the situation because he didn't put his tanks over the top. He kept them behind the crest, what they call sort of a turret down position, because they could kill you. They could put a shell in the front of a Sherman and it'll come out the back. And he could do it 3 miles away. And Ed looked at the situation and figured out, well, maybe I can get these both if I do it right. So he gave gunner control, and the gunner will drop the breech on his gun and look through the gun barrel and watch the gun crest clearance, and he gets his sight on the tank. When he's got crest clearance, then he fires. The dangerous one was the one that was facing him because it has the heavier plate in the front, and it has the gun in the front, which still could get him. In that first tank, he was backing up along a little narrow road with ditches on the side, and he accidentally backed the back corner over the ditch, and it tipped up the next plate. It was just a flat plate, not very thick.
The 45-ton Panther has 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, making it almost impenetrable. But its underside is only 30 millimeters thick and very vulnerable.
He could see what was happening and studied the thing, and he hit it right bang in the middle into this plate. So he just kept firing. This thing brewed up, and I don't know if people get out or not.
when he was going the other way, the gun was pointing away from him, and the back of a Panther tank is not thick. It's probably 3 inches. Put one round at on the other tank, and he ricocheted off the deck and took the commander's head off. Everybody hopped out of that one that could hop out, and that tank was left there.
With that, the last remaining obstacle in the Hochwald Gap is out of the way. And the Canadians push forward to the outskirts of Xanten, their final objective. This is where the Germans have set up their last line of defense. But it's just a matter of time before they are overwhelmed. Allied warplanes mount a series of heavy destructive bombing raids.
Every day, every night, there were bombings of the city. The city, which was before of that never attacked, now was destroyed by about 85%.
I remember the bombings very well. We had to go down to the cellar very often. We heard the alarm sometimes in the middle of the night, and we were really scared. It was terrible. We heard the ordnance rumbling and watched the planes dropping bombs. There was a lot of destruction. There were dead horses lying all around. This was a terrible experience for us.
On March 7th, a month after the fighting in the Rhineland began, and 8 days after their costly attack through the Hochwald, Canadian Sherman tanks roll into Xanten. They capture the bridges over the Rhine and open the way for an all-out Allied advance into the German heartland. Germany will surrender in less than 2 months.
This battle here in the Rhineland is one of the forgotten battles of World War II. It was the Canadian-British Army who opened the gate to Berlin.
In the end, the casualties on both sides are appalling. The Germans lose 40,000 killed and wounded. And for the Canadians, the fighting in the Rhineland, including the Battle of the Hochwald Gap, became their bloodiest campaign in the entire war.
The Rhineland, in terms of casualties, basically 5,300 dead and wounded in, shall we say, 30 days. Like, that surpasses D-Day, it surpasses the worst of the Scheldt.
Strange enough, there isn't a sense of elation. It's more, thank God it's over. Because coming to mind is the people that have been lost, the price paid, and that this is not the end.
Spring 1940. Hitler's armored forces smash their way across Western Europe, and the deadly age of the German Panzer Corps begins. All across the Third Reich, thousands sign up, eager to join the fatherland's legions of mighty armored warriors.
All of us young soldiers were hoping to get to the front.
But it is not long before these idealistic adventurers come face to face with the harsh reality of tank warfare.
We fought every day and were always in action, and had seen a lot of people die.
This is the story of one young German's fight for survival as he battles his way through some of history's greatest tank battles.
This is when I lost my faith in God.
1940. German tanks thunder across Belgium, Holland, and France, crushing everything in their path. In just 6 weeks, Hitler's armies conquer all of Western Europe. The Blitzkrieg, a fast, mobile lightning war led by masses of heavy armor, is unprecedented and redefines modern warfare. The stunning success of the German armor fuels Hitler's propaganda machine. Panzer commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel become celebrities. The Third Reich has found its new heroes.
Panzers were in the tradition of the cavalry, the dashing, the attacking, the riding over the open field. And the National Socialists were very keen on promoting this image of a modern weapon, of modern warfare style. So yes, young men tried to get in there.
One of them is 18-year-old Ludwig Bauer, who joins the Panzertruppen in late 1940.
All us young soldiers were hoping to get to the front. But first we were ordered to Putlos, where we underwent more intense tank training.
Intensive Panzerausbildung gemacht.
Training was extremely exhausting, both physically and mentally.
Sei es körperlich, sei es auch vom Wissen her.
And I took to it like a duck to water.
Ich dann in meinem Element.
And after that training was over,
beendet war,
we got deployed to the front.
Zur Fronttruppe versetzt.
In early 1941, Bauer and thousands of tankers like him are ordered eastward, part of a massive buildup of men and machines. And on June 22nd, after massing over 3 million soldiers and almost 3,600 tanks, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union.
We fought constantly and were always fully in action. There were tank battles and infantry battles every day.
In the initial stage of the attack, German mobile tactics and superior armor easily overwhelms the Soviet defenders. But as the Germans press their attack deeper into the motherland, Soviet resistance intensifies.
The Russians never gave up, no matter how hopeless the situation was. It was sometimes incomprehensible to us, stubborn.
By the fall of 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins to fizzle. After 15 weeks of heavy fighting, the Red Army finally slows the German advance on Moscow. Hitler is determined to seize the capital before winter and orders one last push to finally break the Soviet defenders. But the invasion has cost both sides tremendously. Some German divisions have lost almost 50% of their original invasion force, and the Red Army is holding on by a thread. To protect their capital, the Russians have only 700 light tanks, 100 T-34 medium tanks, and only 47 of their powerful KV-1 heavy tanks, while the Germans attack with 1,000 medium tanks and over 500 light tanks. Most of these the antiquated Panzer II. Originally designed as a stopgap while other tanks were developed, the Panzer II is modestly equipped with a light 20mm gun and only 35mm of frontal armor, and is no match for the more robust Soviet tanks. Piloting one of these outmoded tanks into battle is fledgling Panzer Trooper Ludwig Bauer, who attacks the southern anchor of Moscow's defensive line at the industrial city of Tula.
Tula was a very big city with a major tank industry, and the city was protected by a large tank ditch. And the problem was that apparently the tank ditch was built in a way that no tank was able to drive across it or through it. Overnight, we received the order that about 8 or 9 tanks should be laden with logs on their rear end.
Auf dem Heck, also auf dem Motorraum.
When the attack started at dawn, those tanks started to drive towards the tank ditch. It was a distance of about 1,200 to 1,500 meters.
101.500 Meter.
And the tanks drove towards the tank ditch at top speed. And one of the worst artillery attacks I have ever encountered followed. The Russians shot as much as their barrels were able to. Upon reaching the tank ditch, the tanks turned around. The turret crew would get out and chop off the ropes with an axe. And the logs fell down right into the tank ditch. And the next group of tanks were able to drive over top of them. It was a great adventure, all the more because one of the tanks ended up driving into the ditch. It was covered with the remaining logs, and they had to stay in there until the evening, and all the other tanks drove over them. And then all of the tanks drove uphill towards the outskirts of town. I drove over those logs as well with my Panzer II. And when I got to the top of the hill, I took a direct hit. It probably was a KV-1, so a 7.62, the famous Russian gun.
Der Panzer brannte sofort. Ich konnte aus dem Turm.
The tank caught fire immediately. I was able to jump out of the turret, but my driver and the radio operator burned to death inside the tank. I had 5 bits of shrapnel in my thigh, 1 in my knee and 1 in my eye, so I was just lying there. My comrades carried me out of this hellfire.
Ludwig Bauer is evacuated to a hospital in Orel, and over the next few months, while he recuperates, he is joined by a never-ending stream of fellow soldiers, all victims of Hitler's failing Operation Barbarossa. And although the offensive costs the Germans over 1 million men, for fledgling tankers like Bauer, the war on the Eastern Front is only just beginning. June 1941. Convinced nothing can stop his mighty panzers, Hitler unleashes a massive offensive against the Soviet Union, and so begins the largest invasion in history. But after 6 months of desperate fighting, with 4 million men on both sides killed or wounded, Barbarossa fails. And Hitler's war machine comes to a freezing halt in the Russian winter.
The first winter was horrible. I think we lost more men due to the frost during this first winter than we did due to the enemy.
In fact, lots of soldiers had frostbite on legs, hands, ears and noses. These were the worst injuries, in fact.
I think the weather probably helped us, because German troops were not ready to have military actions in freezing cold conditions. So General Frost helped us.
The Germans in the winter of 1941 had a big problem. Barbarossa had failed, They had over 1 million casualties. They were down to 50% of their strength. So Adolf Hitler wanted to find a new way and to continue fighting against the Soviet Union, despite the fact that the Wehrmacht at this point wasn't a suitable tool anymore.
Undeterred by his losses, Hitler prepares for a massive spring offensive, codenamed Operation Blue. His troops will attack Soviet positions all along the front, stretching from the Caucasus 900 kilometers north to the city of Voronezh. The German High Command sends tens of thousands of reinforcements to the Eastern Front, including Ludwig Bauer, now recovered from wounds he received in the previous year's fighting at Tula.
We had the big advantage in the German army that the wounded soldiers could ask to rejoin their old unit.
Wünschen oder wollten dann alle wieder zu ihrer alten Einheit?
I was redeployed back to Russia to my regiment, joined my unit there, and the Battle of Voronezh was imminent. My company had been assigned to secure a left flank, and we saw 20 Russian tanks driving into the valley at a distance of about 2 kilometers.
Etwa 20 russische Panzer in das Tal fahren.
They said we had to let the Russian tanks come closer to us and then try to shoot them.
Und dann versuche abzuschießen.
The problem for our Panzer III remains the same. We only could fight the Russian tanks at close range.
Die angreifenden russischen Panzer oder russische Panzer nur auf sehr kurze Entfernung bekämpfen konnten.
Because the cannon's performance wasn't good enough. They had just about enough penetrating power for the tanks of that time.
War zwar für die damaligen Panzer.
But with the constantly increasing armor thickness, the penetrating power of this gun with a short barrel was not strong enough, and the enemy tanks could not be destroyed.
Bekämpft werden, wie es sein soll.
In the summer of 1942, the majority of Panzer IIIs in operation are equipped with a short-barreled 50mm main cannon and prove to be ineffective against most Soviet armor. But in an effort to improve their penetrating ability, many Panzer IIIs are outgunned with a more powerful, long-barreled 50mm cannon.
The Russians then made a move to the side and suddenly appeared from the left and were as close as 300 or 400 meters. The combat started right away. I was able to shoot down a T-34 that was about 100 meters away. But at the same time, my tank had been rammed by a Russian KV-1. The tanks were notched into each other, so that we were all very close. The Russian got one hit and couldn't turn the turret anymore because he ran into my tank 2 or 3 times. Then he pulled back to a distance of 10 meters and shot, and the tank caught on fire immediately in the engine bay. We got out. The radio operator and I wanted to get out of this burning hell.
Und wollten nun aus diesem ganzen Feuerzauber raus.
Bauer manages to escape from his burning tank, only to find himself trapped behind enemy lines. And after 3 days of avoiding Russian patrols, he finally makes it back to his regiment. The stubborn Russian defense stuns the German invaders, And over the next few months, Operation Blue progresses very slowly, costing both sides tens of thousands of dead.
The Russians had learned much and were fighting much harder than in 1941. Each Russian man himself was convinced that he had to stand his ground at the point where he was.
In my soul, I knew one thing. Whether I die or not die, I would stay on the spot till death, and I will win.
They even let themselves be rolled over by tanks. It was sometimes incomprehensible to us.
For Ludwig Bauer and his comrades, the hope of a quick and decisive victory on the Eastern Front is all but lost.
They did not come to us as guests. They tortured our people, shot them down. They will get here over our dead bodies.
In the summer of 1942, Hitler launches Operation Blue in a desperate attempt to complete his conquest of Russia. But after months of bloody fighting, the attack slows to a crawl, and tens of thousands of German soldiers die in the face of ferocious Russian resistance. By the fall of 1942, the Red Army has taken the steam out of the German invasion. Now, all along the Eastern Front, the Soviets prepare to strike back. And to do this, they'll take a page from Hitler's own playbook and spearhead the attacks with massive armored formations, led by their T-34 main battle tanks.
The T-34 was a tank that was not very beautiful and not very sophisticated, but the Russians could produce it in vast numbers in very short time. The Germans built tanks that were fine products of German engineering, but the numbers they could produce it were therefore very limited.
Our tank was fast. It could change direction fast. Forgive me, heavy tanks are like cars on ice in comparison to the T-34.
The T-34 is considered the best medium tank of the Second World War. Well armed with a 76mm main cannon and well protected by 45mm of sloped frontal armor, the T-34 has a decisive edge over its German counterparts.
The T-34 was a great tank, of course. And we certainly had a lot of respect for it.
By the summer of 1942, the Russians have fielded thousands of these impressive tanks. Now, almost anywhere the Germans choose to attack, they inevitably encounter scores of T-34s.
We came to this castle-like property that probably belonged to a Russian earl. A beautiful, huge park with a huge property and very neat. We expected to get some rest. Suddenly in the morning, we had an alert. And before we could even get everything together, the park was full of Russian tanks. And we got into a tank battle. If the target was moving, we couldn't fire directly onto the target.
Kann man ja nicht auf das Ziel selbst schießen,
but had to aim at where the target was going to.
Wo das Ziel noch nicht ist.
The commander in the turret had an aiming spike.
Einen Zielstachel.
And on the right and the left side, 5 little triangles at a certain distance from each other.
Einen gewissen Abstand.
And these little triangles help to find the right deflection when firing at a moving target.
Wenn man auf ein fahrendes Ziel schießt.
We shot 7 Russian tanks.
7 russische Panzer abgeschossen.
times the Russian planes were dropping bombs.
Bomben abgeworfen.
We took cover, and while doing this, we unfortunately ended up in a graveyard.
Auf dem Friedhof gelandet.
And this turned out to be one of my most horrible experiences. The Russian planes and artillery were firing heavily on us.
Feuer auf uns in starkem Maß eröffnet.
And while doing this, they had torn open the graves and the dead came out.
Wo die Toten dann rauskamen.
And everywhere, half or three-quarter decayed bodies and skulls were lying around. On the tanks, there was a half-decayed leg, still covered in the shroud.
Leintuch oder was.
All of us, we had to throw up. We left the graveyard in a hurry without even caring that the enemy was firing on us.
Auf feindliches Feuer haben wir den Friedhof verlassen.
And then we received the order that 5 tanks, including me, should leave the woods and should go down into the valley.
In dieses Tal runterfahren.
And the Russians opened up an unbelievable artillery barrage. My tank got a direct hit on the right side, so that the turret was torn open.
So aufgerissen wurde.
And the commander, Lieutenant Rochel, had about 40 shell splinters from head to toe. The gunner had been torn apart, and I only caught a few pieces of shrapnel.
The rest of Bauer's crew is killed in the explosion, but he still manages to maneuver his tank out of the battle and back to the safety of the German lines. But he is one of the lucky few.
Operation Blue was a failure, technically and operationally, and the losses were tremendous. The German army in this year had losses up to 1 million, and they lost nearly 75–80% of the tanks. The Wehrmacht was absolutely a shadow of its former self. There was nothing left.
For Bauer and the other German survivors, the fall of 1942 will mark a turning point in the battle. After 16 months of desperate resistance, the Soviet defenders are finally ready to strike back.
They were very determined when they were fighting. And they were tough opponents. There's no doubt about that.
Keine Frage.
Hitler's war on the Eastern Front has been raging for 16 months, but his mighty panzer formations have been unable to break through Russian defenses. By October 1942, the German offensive has lost momentum, and the Soviets launched their own attacks all along the Eastern Front.
The main strength of the Russian Army Corps was always the mass. The Russians always formed waves of tanks and sent them forward as a massive hammerhead.
As the Germans continue their slow advance in the south, Red Army forces defending Moscow attack westward. And once again, Ludwig Bauer is in the crosshairs.
In October, my company was driving towards a Russian attack.
Die Kompanie, in der ich war, die erste Kompanie, wir fuhren dem russischen Angriff entgegen.
There were about 30 Russian tanks approaching us. And we wanted to run into the flank of this offensive. For some reason, the company chief, First Lieutenant Bittner, informed us via radio, all commanders to see me. And all commanders of 10 or 11 tanks went to see him.
Gingen dann zu dem Panzer von dem Kompaniechef.
And suddenly, one of the Russian tanks fired from the side.
Beide geschossen, in Volltreffer.
All the commanders were killed or badly injured.
Sind schwer verwundet geworden.
And everything was upside down.
Auf den Kopf gestellt.
And during the chaos,
Durcheinander.
the Russian tanks attacked us from all sides.
Seiten auf uns zugefahren.
We weren't able to place a good shot as an immense artillery barrage approached us.
Zum Schuss, als ein solches starkes Feuer, russisches Feuer kam.
The Russians attacked with an anti-tank gun that was like our 88.
One of the Red Army's most powerful anti-tank weapons is the 76mm ZIS-3. Originally designed as a long-range artillery gun, the ZIS-3 has proven highly effective against tanks, especially when firing their deadly, armor-piercing, high-explosive rounds.
The Russians had a hard time with these types of shells. The shell penetrated through the tank turret. It went right through the body of the gunner and almost ripped him apart right through the middle.
In der Mitte auseinander.
Ricocheted off the inner surface and fell to the floor and stayed there as a dud. And then the driver came up to me and said, "I refuse to drive any further unless this dud is removed from the tank."
Bevor nicht der Blindgänger aus dem Panzer rauskommt.
And I picked up the dud very carefully, took it to the hatch and dropped it outside, and during its fall, the shell exploded.
Und beim Runterfallen ist die Granate explodiert.
I was totally exhausted, and I was just 19 years old when I went through all of this.
After 3 more months of desperate fighting, Ludwig Bauer is given special leave. And just as he is returning home in January of 1943, his comrades on the Eastern Front are locked in the bloody climax of Operation Blue at the infamous city of Stalingrad.
Stalingrad was a turning point in regards to the fact that from the beginning of January 1943, everything went backwards and downhill. Many of my comrades weren't at all thinking about victory anymore. It was more like, how can we survive the defeat as well as possible?
In the summer of 1943, Ludwig Bauer would return back to the front as an officer and find himself in a very different war against a very different and determined enemy. After their disastrous defeat at Stalingrad in January of 1943, the German army on the Eastern Front faces a massive Soviet offensive. For the next few months, the Russians pound the retreating Germans. And by the summer, they have been forced 300 kilometers back towards Germany.
And we were, once again, fighting every day non-stop. The division had almost entirely run dry in terms of equipment and people. And there was talks that the 9th Panzer Division, that was my division, would be pulled out to undergo refitting. All the soldiers of the entire division were to be shipped to the south of France.
Nach Südfrankreich verladen werden.
But for Bauer and his regiment, their much-needed reprieve from battle is short-lived. On June 6, 1944, only a month after arriving in France, the Allies launch Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion in history. The Germans are quickly overwhelmed, and throughout the summer and fall of 1944, the Allies push them 850 kilometers across Europe. But as they near the German border, Hitler prepares for a huge offensive in the Ardennes. And once again, the assault will be led by Germany's panzers. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, over 1,500 German tanks launch their attack. The German tanks initially catch the Americans off guard. But in just a few short days, their advance grinds to a halt as the Allies begin to reorganize and fight back. Charge of their counterattack is the latest in Allied armor, the M4A3 Easy 8 Sherman tank. The Easy 8 is armed with a high-velocity 76mm main gun and has 63mm of frontal armor. But the Sherman's biggest advantage over its German counterparts is its ease of manufacturing, enabling the Allies to put hundreds into action all along the Ardennes battlefront.
Sherman M4, you could destroy 100 of them, there were 120 more.
We saw the tanks, the Sherman. I was in position with my assault gun. The Americans started attacking us with tanks. And we were able to put the attack down in a classic tank battle. The Germans used the so-called mission-type tactics. And the American army used the order-type tactics. The difference for me was substantial.
Sehr beachtlich, für mich sehr groß.
The order-type tactics that the Americans used didn't leave any room for the commander. While the unit commander is being told what to attack, he is also being told how to do this. And the German unit commander was able to decide for himself. And this German tactic helped to achieve all the great results.
Eigentlich die großen Erfolge gezeigt.
We were able to shoot at them from as close as 800 meters.
Gut auf 800 Meter, die Kameraden.
And that's what we did. We picked them off. And in front of us on a hill, there were American tanks that were hit and were burning.
Panzer, brennend.
And so I continued driving and was put in charge of one assault gun against maybe 30 Shermans.
Gefecht geführt, ein Sturmgeschütz gegen vielleicht 30 Sherman.
And I got hit pretty fast.
Gleich relativ schnell einen Volltreffer.
And my driver lost the upper part of his head. So he is sitting there with only half of his head.
Ohne mit halbem Kopf noch drin.
So that was it for me.
By the beginning of 1945, German forces in the Ardennes have lost over 40% of their initial strength. And on January 7th, Hitler calls off the attack, and the Battle of the Bulge comes to an end.
At this point, we already figured it was impossible to win the war.
The few forces that have survived the battle retreat back into Germany and prepare for what will soon become some of the Second World War's most ferocious battles in defense of the fatherland. After 3 weeks of fighting, Allied forces in Belgium finally repel Hitler's Ardennes offensive. And in March of 1945, U.S. forces cross the Rhine River and advance into Germany. Desperate to halt the invasion of the fatherland, all remaining German units prepare to meet the Allies. And among them, once again, leading a unit of Panther tanks, is Ludwig Bauer.
We continued to Antwerp, and there I had to report to a Captain Atario, a guy from Vienna. And he told me that they were expecting an American attack. And so I asked him where to position myself, and he said here and there. Position your tanks over there in defensive position, and you yourself will return with your tank, and you will take position in the middle of the village. So we took position in front of a shoemaker's house. And I have to say that we hadn't been able to leave the tank since December 17, when the whole Ardennes offensive started. And so we went to the shoemaker's house, lay down on the floor, took a nap, and the Panther was standing in front of the house. All of a sudden I heard shots, and Americans were shouting, "Comrade, come out, the war is over." And all the different tanks that were standing outside the village drove in, and I saw them pass by. And of course, I wanted to save the tank. I made it out of the house by shimmying down the eaves trough and climbed on the tank from the back.
Hinterm Haus abgeseilt, runtergehangelt und bin von hinten rum auf den Panzer gestiegen.
Suddenly, 5 or 6 Americans jumped on the tank, and I was sitting in the driver's seat. One put his head inside the tank at the radio operator's side,
Auch offen, hat den Kopf reingesteckt.
and his head was maybe this much apart from mine, and I stopped breathing and thought that he would for sure hear my heart hammering.
Dachte, der hört mein Herz klopfen.
Then he just left, and the Yanks jumped off the Panther and were standing in front of it.
Panther runtergesprungen und standen vor dem Panther.
And I thought, now or never. I started the engine and moved forward.
Gelassen, bin angefahren.
And they jumped aside in horror. I had to drive about 20 meters up to the main road, and I left the village.
Straße rauffahren, dann bin ich links gegangen und dann bin ich also aus der Ortschaft rausgefahren.
I got hit by 3 bazookas. And one hit the gun mantlet.
Hat die Aufhängung der Kanone gedrückt.
It fell forward and the camouflage net closed the hatch.
Das Tarnnetz auf der Kanone hat die Luke zugemacht.
And I couldn't see much.
Und so viel konnte ich noch sehen.
And on the other side, the tanks of my own company were standing there, and a Hetzer picked me off.
Von einer fremden, wissen Sie, ein sturmgeschützten Hetzer, und hat mich abgeschossen.
I got hit, and the Panther started burning. And I couldn't get out of the tank because of the camouflage net. I tried to get out and just hit the net, and I was sure that that was it.
Da dachte ich, jetzt ist Feierabend eigentlich.
And I fell back and saw the flames going through the net, and I was able to tear the net apart and could get out.
Es brennt die Netz auseinander.
I burned my ear, my back, my arm, my uniform.
Brand, Arm, alles Uniform, gehen in Fetzen runter.
And this was my personal ending of the war. This was my 9th hit and my 7th injury.
Less than 2 months later, Soviet and Allied forces converge on Berlin. And on May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. Throughout the Second World War, Germany's Panzer Corps was time and again called on to lead the charge into battle. German armored tactics forever changed the way modern armies would fight, and a new age of warfare was born. But these deadly developments came at a terrible price. Between 1940 and 1945, the German army on the Eastern Front lost 50,000 tanks and 4 million men. For the Soviets, the losses are even more staggering, with an estimated 80,000 tanks destroyed and 7 million soldiers lost. And those that did survive, like Ludwig Bauer, still live with the terrible memories.
At that time, we were all soldiers that were used to war by now and had seen a lot of people die.
Menschen sterben sehen.
And so we prayed to God that He would make us win the war and that He would let us survive.
Dass wir den Sieg davon tragen sollen und das überleben sollen.
I could not understand that we were praying to God to win the war and kill the others, more or less.
Gebeten wird, Sieg zu erreichen, die anderen zu töten, mehr oder weniger.
And on the other hand, the enemy was praying to God to win the war and kill us.
Die anderen uns zu töten und den Sieg zu erreichen. Und ich habe dort.
This is when I lost my faith in God.